Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Greetings and peace, loved ones. What's going on? This is Baraka Blue. Before I introduce this podcast, I want to let you know I have some tour dates coming up. First, I'll be in Lebanon from September 7th through 11th for a retreat called The Secrets of Silence and Speech. This is with the Lighthouse Initiative. Dr. Hibba, who is a scholar from Lebanon, a professor at the American University of Beirut, and her organization. This will be the third time that I've been out there. And if you're anywhere in the Middle East, I highly recommend coming. Dr. Omar Farouk Abdullah will be there. The great emcee, Brother Ali, will be there. Ali Keeler from Firdaus Ensemble will be there, and others. I'll be doing some performances as well as some workshops. And then I'll be in the UK on the 15th, the 16th of September. Saturday, I'll be in London. 17th, I'll be Peterborough. 18th, Leicester. 19th, Luton. 20th, Nottingham. 21st, Derby. 23rd, I'll be back in London. There's a Sufi conference and a Mawlid with Sheikh Tijani that I'll be attending. 24th, I'll be in London. There'll be an all-day retreat in nature with the Rabbani Project. That's the Pearls. That should be beautiful. 25th, I'll be in Wales. 26th, Manchester. 27th or 28th, Bradford. And then 29th, again, Manchester. Then I fly to Chicago. For the 1st through the 3rd of October, I'll be at the Iman Retreat. I'm looking forward to that. And then there is a retreat from the 6th through the 9th of October in Indiana, which is, I understand it's near Chicago. It's about an hour away from Chicago. And the retreat is called The Priceless Repository of Our Primordial Nature, Al-Fitra. That's also with Dr. Omar Farouk Abdullah, and he'll be covering a text he wrote about the Fitra, about the primordial nature, the essence, the original nature and potential of the human being and how to connect with our true nature. So I'll be performing at that as well. I'm pretty excited about all those. So those are just the dates, but if you want more information about venues, etc., you can go to my Facebook, facebook.com/Baraka Blue, and you can get all those details there. And you could just message us as well. Yeah, so that's all I have for dates. Now, this podcast is with Sidi Abdul-Rehman Malik, who was a friend of mine for a long time. He's a journalist. He's an activist, organizer. He's someone who is from Canada but has been involved living in Toronto. He's from Toronto, but he's been living in London for many years and involved with Radical Middle Way, Q News, if you remember that, and many, many other endeavors. And he's someone who has a lot of insights on the community, from scholarship to artists to activism to organizing. And it's always a blessing to talk to him. In the beginning, we talked about coffee. That's also one of his secrets, is that he's the hidden imam of coffee, as I like to call him. He really is an aficionado of the bean and also a historian of it. In fact, he has a BBC radio show, and he did a mini radio documentary on the history of coffee and its relationship to Islam. So in the beginning of the podcast, I had him drop a little knowledge about that. But I think you'll enjoy. So I'll let you have the podcast. If you'd like to support, thank you so much for listening. It's an honor. It's a blessing for me to share these. You can support on Patreon, patreon.com/pathandpresent. And just check out the Patreon site. You see, Patreon's pretty cool. It allows people to support artistic endeavors, creative endeavors, support content that they like from content creators all around the world. and you know, you can give $1, $5 a month, or whatever, and it's kind of a way for community to support endeavors like this. So, without further ado, here's Abdul-Rehman Malik. Assalamu alaikum. Bismillah. Abdul-Rehman Malik, it's great to talk to you, my brother.
It's wonderful to speak to you, Sidi. It's I know we've been thinking about and planning a conversation like this for a long time. So I'm really pleased that we've been able to do it, even though we're not in the same place physically and we're at two ends of the world. You are in paradise, and I'm in modern, urban, cosmopolitan, messy London.
Well, it's been a blessing that every time I come to London, it's obligatory that I visit you if I can, and if you're in town. And we tend to meet in like some secret, undisclosed, avant-garde, third wave coffee shop that only 7 people on earth know about. And that's why I call you the hidden imam of coffee. And but also, over the years, like, we found ourselves in the same place at the same time in different continents, whether it's Singapore or Seattle. So that's a blessing as well.
It has been. It's been a real blessing, and I just think it's the Baraka friendship, and there's this alchemy, I think, between coffee and friendship, and I've felt that alchemy all my life, to be honest, because my love affair with coffee really began with my parents, because in our house, in our home, we always drank tea. We never brewed coffee. Tea was sort of, the libation that kept you going. It punctuated the day. It provided opportunities for the family to come together, or to hang out for a little bit, or to recover from the vicissitudes of life. But coffee was something, we went out for. We went out for coffee and donuts. We purchased a cup of coffee. We sat in a cafe. There was life and busyness and people around. And I think since the very beginning of my experience with coffee, I've always seen it as this incredible social beverage. And so I think over the years, the friendships that I've come to value and the people I've come to love, so many of those friendships and so much of that love has been cultivated over coffee. And I feel that's the way with us as well. I remember when we were in Seattle, and it turned out that we were there together, and you mentioned, hey, let's meet at this coffee shop, this incredible place just by the water, and it was the most gorgeous sunny day, and we sat there, and I think we had 3 or 4 different beans, and it was beautiful, and I knew that our friendship and our love was cemented right there, and so it's entirely right and appropriate that, alhamdulillah, when Allah has allowed our paths to intersect, that there's always coffee involved. It's the Mohammedan bean for a reason.
Yeah, I wanted to get into that. I wanted to hear that, because I know you're someone who I've learned probably the most about the history of coffee. And, I'm a fan just of mastery of anything. And, in a certain sense, if you've mastered anything, it's as if you've mastered everything. Just mastery and devotion to something gives you a certain vantage point. And excellence, of course, ihsan, excellence is so tied to the spiritual path. But you're someone who taught me a lot about the history of coffee. And I know you did a BBC radio documentary recently about the history of coffee. So I'll put the link to that with this podcast so people can find it.
That'd be wonderful.
But why don't you,
for me,
why don't you summarize maybe some of that history and why you feel that it's important, and especially for Muslims, to understand that heritage?
I think that for me, the history of coffee is deeply tied to the spiritual DNA of Muslim civilizations and actually Muslim cultures. Because in many ways, coffee, for some divine reason, some divine secret, coffee was only given to the Horn of Africa, particularly the place that we call Ethiopia today. it's indigenous to those particular lands. So in a way, Ethiopia is where coffee has its origins or first creation, but it's in the Yemen that coffee finds its soul. And I think there's something really beautiful about that. Part of it is about migration, and people migrate, but plants and nature also migrates. And there was this migration from the Horn of Africa, Ethiopia in particular, to the Yemen, where coffee flourished in that blessed soil. And it was in the first discovery of coffee as a means for devotion. There's so many interesting characters in the early history of coffee, and some of that history is controversial in the sense that even the early Muslim historians of coffee would argue over whether it was Hadrat Ali ibn Umar al-Shadali al-Aidarus, who was the one who popularized coffee, or whether it was his teacher or whether it was his contemporary. But what we definitely know is that the discovery of the bean as a means to, as a means for devotion, as a means of liveliness so that people could worship God, definitely happened in the Yemen. It happened among the Sufis of the Yemen. And it was in those tariqas, in those brotherhoods of love for God and love for the Prophet, upon whom be peace, that coffee became means to further that devotion. So in the very DNA of the beverage, there is this, it's encoded that this is something that is drunk together amongst a brotherhood or a fraternity of people, and it has a higher purpose. And that higher purpose, of course, initially was devotion. But, nothing can be controlled. And that's what, I mean, you're a cultural producer par excellence. And I think one of the things we all understand about culture is you can't control culture. You can't place jurisprudence around culture. You can't put fences around it. Because culture is like water. It seeps. It seeps far beyond the places where it began. And as a culture of coffee was created amongst the Sufi fraternities of the Yemen, people started experiencing it outside of that context. And yet their reference was always back to the people who founded it, which is why there was such a great devotion to those early characters and early personalities of coffee culture, like Sheikh Ali ibn Umar al-Shadali al-Aidarus and others, because there was a reference that, we owe this beverage and the culture that it has spawned because of these people. And because of trade, coffee spread very quickly. And of course, the natural place it went first was the Hijaz and to Mecca. And there we find the first, in the early 1500s, find the first major controversies around coffee. There's a fatwa against the imbibing and the production of coffee, because coffee was seen as disruptive. And I think this, for me, is that second element of coffee. Coffee is a disruptive beverage in the way that the history of alcohol is often tied to sublimating the intellect and about a wanton Dionysian joy and pleasure. Coffee is the exact opposite. It's a beverage which is always associated with gathering, thinking, disruption, revolution, breaking the social order. And in a way, when the people of the Yemen started brewing coffee in the precinct of the Holy Kaaba and sharing the beverage and reciting Maulid while they were drinking it and doing dhikr and gathering outside of the normal spaces that people gathered, that was socially disruptive. And that social disruption annoyed political authority. Political authority for a time feared it, and actually feared it right up into the Ottoman days when, Murad the Grim banned coffee, because Murad the Grim felt that the coffee houses and the imbibing of coffee was causing people to become seditious because they were talking to each other. And in some ways, the spread of coffee from the Hijaz to Cairo, Damascus, Aleppo, Baghdad, Basra, Mosul. I mean, this kind of incredible spread of coffee and how quickly it happened. Eventually, Constantinople, what we call Istanbul today, each place that it went, it created a culture of gathering. So if it was the streets outside the Al Azhar, where the students from the Yemen would roast their beans and crush them and share them with their fellow students, or it was the little coffee kiosks that initially formed in the back streets of Damascus, eventually those little institutions of gathering became large institutions of gathering. And one of the scholars of coffee talks about the fact that before the emergence of coffee as a social beverage, if we were to really think about where were gathering spaces, it was the mosque, it was the madrasa, and it was the markaz. It was the souk.
Mm-hmm.
These were the places where people gathered, or in their own homes, in their own divans, in their own living spaces. Taverns appeared from time to time, sometimes in great numbers, sometimes in lesser numbers in Islamic civilization. But those were disruptive in a very, very different way because on the outward, they were, from a point of view of religious authority, they were haram. So there were always sort of speakeasies or undergrounds. And of course, there's a really interesting story about alcohol culture in Muslim civilizations as well. But the emergence of coffee allowed for the establishment of the coffee house, of the cafehane, of the place that you gathered to drink. And for me, that is the real revolution that happened socially, because now there was a place where people could talk. And that's the revolution which got exported to Vienna and to Venice and to London and to Paris.
Well,
and to
yeah.
Amsterdam.
So maybe introduce us to that history, because it was very recently that Europe actually took on coffee. It was in the Muslim world for hundreds of years. So its arrival to Europe is more recent. How does that happen?
So you have coffee for maybe 200 years in the Muslim world. But of course, with the encounter between rising Western empires and Muslim empires, there of course was so much cultural exchange, intellectual exchange, and of course coffee was in that exchange. So you find by the early 1600s, coffee beginning to appear in parts of Europe. By the mid 1600s, late 1600s, you see the emergence of coffee houses in places like Vienna and London in particular. Often we talk about Vienna or Venice or the Italian experience of coffee as being quintessentially European, but London was really the great city of coffee, and that was because there was trade between the Ottoman Empire and the British Isles. In fact, the first people to bring coffee over to the United Kingdom, what we call the United Kingdom now, the British Isles, in a significant way was a fellow named Pasquale Rosé, who was, we think, maybe Greek or Italian. He was in service to an English businessman who was doing trade with the Ottoman Turks, and they had lived in what would now be the Greek islands, but Ottoman territory at the time, and they had returned back to London. And part of the deal that Pasquale Rosé had with his with basically the person he was indentured to was let us bring back coffee beans, because they both loved coffee and they both loved Ottoman coffee. He said, let us bring back coffee beans and let us begin a little business. Let me try it out. And so on a little lane off the Corner Hill in the old city of London, there you can still see a beautiful blue plaque, which is now in front of a pub. And it says, here established the first coffee house by Pasquale Rosé. And it wasn't even a coffee house, it was a coffee shack. He would get the beans, he would roast them on an open fire, he would crush them, and then he would boil them. And then he would serve this, what became known in sort of London literary society initially as the bitter Mohammedan gruel. And he would serve cups of bitter Mohammedan gruel. And this bitter gruel became so popular because it was like nothing people had tasted before. It didn't make them intoxicated. In fact, it made them sharper. They wanted to talk late into the night. And in fact, one of the first major campaigns against coffee was the first major campaign of prohibition, even before the campaign against the prohibition of alcohol, was by a group of women who during the 1700s had a petition against coffee, and they use language that is profoundly anti-Muslim, anti-Turk, anti-East, saying that coffee is they describe it as a Turkish vixen, as a Turkish princess who has taken over the minds of our men and the hearts of our men, and they've fallen in love with this thing. And so there's this sensuality of the East that is dangerous and associated with coffee. But at its height, there was a coffee shop in London for every 140 citizens, thousands of cafes, and each was a local institution. And these cafes were remarkable. You know, one of the cafes was Lloyd's, and that Lloyd's became Lloyd's of London, which became the first insurance company and one of the first banks. It was in coffee houses that news services started. It was in coffee houses that newspapers started. There was cafes, City, and you can just imagine this. You know, I close my eyes and I can see it, where to enter one of these cafes, one would have to recite a fresh line of poetry or give a new piece of news. And it was fairly democratic, because if you came into a cafe and they said, "What news do you bring?" and if you gave a piece of news that perhaps had already been heard, or that wasn't juicy enough for the clientele, they would say, "No, don't let him in," or they would say, "Come on in." And one of the other amazing things about the cafe was the rules. In the old Indian cafes, particularly in the Bombay cafes and some of the cafes in southern India, you can still see pictures where you go in and there's rules. There's rules of the cafe. You know, no spitting, no farting, no indecent noises. Keep convivial. You know, don't steal the cutlery. There's all these rules on the wall. So one of the rules of these old London cafes was that no conversation was a private conversation. So if you and I were having this conversation, then anyone could walk in and sit next to us and join in. What are you talking about? And jump in with their opinions. It was, Habermas calls it the great democratic public square. It was that public space. And when you think about a cafe, say in Baghdad or Halab or Basra or Damascus or Istanbul, think about the men who were coming into that space. They were of different ranks and different classes. And European travelers were shocked because there was no such institutions in Europe. There was no places where rich and poor, working class and merchant and wealthy could gather in the same place, where stories were told and scholars discussed and games were played and music was enjoyed. That's the spirit of the cafe. And that takes a hold on Europe very, very quickly. And of course, there's what I call the dark side to coffee, which is coffee's association with global empire, with global trade, how coffee eventually travels to South America and for a time is linked with slavery, and the production of coffee with the exploitation and the violence that is slavery. And this is part of what makes up the whole story. And in some ways, it's encouraging that we have friends like Mukhtar al-Khanshali and there's other pioneers around the world who are really trying to revive not just the history of coffee, but the craft of the production of coffee in Muslim lands like the Yemen, or in places like Mindanao in the southern Philippines, or the coffee scene, as you know, in Indonesia is wildly amazing. But all these places, most of these places are recipients of coffee from an original source, and they've made it their own.
Yeah, all of that stuff is fascinating, and it's really beautiful to me that it started as a tool to draw one near to the divine, and to, because interestingly enough, across religious traditions, one thing I found is that, you find with the Buddhists, you find definitely in Islam, especially amongst the Sufis and many other traditions, there's an idea that the early morning, the last third of the night, the time before sunrise, is a special time to awaken, to become enlightened. And so, of course, what better way to wake up than coffee in your cup, And so
exactly.
If the Sufis found out, hey, it's easier for us to do our night vigil, to do our prayers and our meditations and our chanting if we imbibe this beverage. And that's so beautiful. And you know, the other thing is that all words for coffee that I'm aware of in every language, they come from Arabic, qahwa, except for
Yes.
Ethiopian, which it's buni. Is it buni or buna?
Yes, that's right. That's right.
And so, you know, because we have kahve, cafe, coffee,
Yes.
you know, kopi in Indonesia, it's kopi.
Yes.
But it
that's
all
right.
comes from qahwa, which means, I think you were the one who first told me this, it means the invigorating wine in Arabic.
Yeah, and the words, there's a whole language that the Muslims created around coffee. So one of the terms that the early historians of the coffee used was this term called marqaha, which is the feeling of sprightliness and well-being and elevation of the spirit that one feels when one imbibes a good cup of coffee. And I've always found that really interesting because, you know, there's this thing among baristas that sometimes I'll talk about, the God shot, you know, especially baristas who work with espresso at a very, very sophisticated level. You know, not just the measuring and the weighing and the temperatures, but the equipment and the machines and the milliseconds of timing. And it's all to get that shot of coffee, that shot of espresso, that when you taste it, it is so stimulating, so flavorful. It's without bitterness, but it encompasses your mouth with the range of tastes that you just have to kind of roll your eyes, and we would kind of say Allah, you know, that's the God shot. And in fact, you know, I almost keep a diary of coffee experiences, and there's very few experiences. I've had some amazing coffee experiences, but there's only a handful that I would say approach that kind of almost transcendent moment where you had it and you had to close your eyes. And you had to appeal to spiritual language because there's no other language that can describe it. It's not just a good cup or a tasty cup. It's an Allah cup. And you know, I can remember those moments. And I can also remember as you said, I mean, so beautifully, it's the ihsan of the barista at that moment and watching them and how much care they took, much beyond the amount I was paying for it. And in fact, I remember the first time I had that experience was with my wife Farina, and we were it was before our son was born, and you know, we'd been at a market in East London, and we had this lovely little cafe. It was called the Taste of Bitter Love, and it was an Australian couple who ran it, and it was a little hole in the wall on Hackney Road here in East London. And you know, we went and we actually both had maybe a flat white or something. And then the barista, who we'd gotten to know over several months, came over with 2 espresso cups. And he said, I've just been working on something, and I just want you guys to taste it and tell me what you think. And I remember there was Farina who took that, you know, took a sip of it first. And she just went really quiet. And it was that kind of pregnant pause. And then I took it. And I fell into the same. It was that moment where you're like, mashallah, this is something special. It's like nothing I've ever tasted before. And it's so wholly satisfying. And I think we just sat in silence as we had it. And then afterwards it was like, what was that? That was something else. And I think, you know, it's, I mean, as an artist, I imagine that the most powerful moments, and, you know, I've seen you recite your poetry, perform, and talk. I've had the honor of, you know, of interviewing you, you know, during a performance, and to see that happen. But I know there's some nights where you've said a poem where silence is the only appropriate response, where it's a moment of transcendence, isn't it? And I think in any art, and coffee is an art, if there's a moment of transcendence, it's that place where, you know, our Christian friends have a lovely concept. It's from Celtic Christianity about the thin places. They say that there's certain places in the world which are thin places, which are places where the fabric between the seen and the unseen, the natural and the supernatural, the human and the divine are so thin that it's translucent. You can't see it clearly, but you can feel it. You can almost touch it.
Beautiful.
And I think art is that way too. I think art creates thin spaces. And of course, we know that God is with us and surround us and sustaining us. But in our human perception of the divine and of transcendence, there are moments where poetry, art, culture creates the thin space. And I won't lie, I think a beautiful cup of coffee filled with markaha creates a thin space where through a different experience, this time the experience of taste and of smell and color, that we're almost taken to that level. And I think that's in a way the noble possibilities of art and culture. And sometimes those thin spaces are created in the most unusual places, isn't it? Things that we wouldn't think take us to that point, that reduce us to tears, that cause prayers to come from our mouths, are sometimes things that we wouldn't expect that to happen. And I think that's the alchemy of culture. That's the alchemy of art, because we don't know what piece of art, what cultural production will take us to that point. And sometimes it surprises us.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I think I often think about the fact that plants are so central to human culture. And I think we can often forget. And, they have the hierarchy of needs. We need food and drink. We need clothing and shelter. And these are important needs, obviously, But once we fulfill those, definitely we need relationship and meaning and things like that. But we also fundamentally, as human beings, crave to have our state altered. We crave to be transported, as you say, into a different state. And if we look around the world at experiences, someone goes. If you think about primal humanity around a campfire, and someone stands up and starts, either singing or dancing or telling a story or reciting a poem that is a story, an epic poem, and this transports everyone in the space. And part of it is, there's the fire, and so the shadow and the light and the darkness, and then there's what is happening. And often, like plants, there's many plants which assist in facilitating a transformation where we all can move into a different space. And it's interesting, from shamanic tribes in the Amazon jungle to all the way up through any other place you could imagine. Different plants are central to every single culture. And it's interesting. And certain cultures try to regulate the plants that are permissible or acceptable, or the way that they're used and things of that nature. And I think about, obviously, tea is so central. Coffee is so central. Obviously, alcohol is so central to many human cultures and the kind of global culture now. As someone who doesn't drink alcohol, and I think most Muslims can share the fact that you pray is, whatever, especially in modern liberal thing, like you pray, whatever, we all do our different thing. But alcohol is so central to socialization, to business meetings, to friendship, to after work, we're getting a drink, after this and that. Oh, hey, I'd love to meet you. Oh, you're interested in dating a member of the opposite sex. Hey, meet you at a bar, at a restaurant. Like, if you're not drinking alcohol, it totally, sets you apart.
It is disruptive. It's disruptive to the social fabric sometimes.
But it's interesting about the, and so coffee, for me, for instance, I've found, and of course, a poem comes when it comes. You can't force it, but there are certain things you can do to put yourself in that state of receptivity. And for me, the best time is in the morning. And it's, for me, if I walk, like going for a walk, and then, walk into a cafe, sitting down, drinking coffee and reading. reading, like a work of the great spiritual masters, whether it's poetry or whether it's literature, whether it's philosophy or, things like that, stories, and then this will spark something. So it's a mix of the kind of what I'm reading and what I'm drinking and the fact that I've walked and I've, breathed the fresh air, and then a poem will come. So I found like that's the way, like coffee plus fresh air plus reading a good book, that's how to spark a poem for me.
I love what you said about plants, and I love what you said about that engagement that we have with with the kind of the natural world and the vegetal world around us. My wife does some volunteer work at a cancer hospice just nearby. It's kind of an East London institution, St. Joe's. And if you walk into the garden there, there are certain plants which literally people are attracted to. Vines, greenery, flowers. And there's something that it's almost like there's a secret in them. There's something, there's a secret there, and that the heart is attracted to. And there's certain places in that garden, whenever I've gone, I've always noticed that there's certain places where people always sit, and there's other places that they sit less. And what you just said just kind of sparked in me that thought that, there must be something in those places, the proximity of the plants, the aesthetics, but also something about the quality of the natural world around us. And of course, we know from West African traditions that the plant world is alive with the supernatural.
Absolutely.
The plant in Indonesia, we often hear about the old stories, from places like Kalimantan and the forests of Java, that the spirits reside amongst the leaves and the trees and within nature itself. And I think some Puritans might be quick to dismiss that as superstition. But I think we know that the vastness of God's creation and the vastness of the unseen world, which outweighs the world that we see, I think forces us to be humble.
Yeah, absolutely. And even science is proving is what the traditional cultures always knew, is that, for instance, they figure out that specific plants, if they're being eaten by a predatory creature, that the plants nearby will somehow receive communication from the plant that's being eaten, and they will chemically change so that their leaves become bitter, so that they won't be eaten.
That's so intriguing. It's incredible.
And I was listening to a Radio Lab podcast, I think. I can't remember all the details, but it was about the specific root structures in forests and how they communicate, and they find which ones of the trees are sick or in need of specific nutrients, and the roots will actually like pass it on to the next tree. Like one tree's like, I got enough, pass it on. So science is just starting to realize the extent to which, the idea of consciousness, and even who's conscious, who's not conscious, and what is conscious and what's not conscious, is still, a question which is up for grabs. I mean, we don't even understand what consciousness is and what creates consciousness. Right. So absolutely. And, like I remember reading Ibn Arabi, Journey to the Lord of Power, where he talks about his spiritual ascensioning, his awakening. And he said, at first, all the keys and secrets to the mineral kingdom were revealed to me. And it was so powerful and so beautiful that it was like, I want to stop here and just be in awe of this. He said, but a voice said, don't stop, focus on Allah. And so I kept going, and then the keys to the plant kingdom were all revealed to me, and I saw and understood it all in the divine sight. And it was so powerful, even more powerful than the mineral kingdom. And part of me wanted to just observe that and just be in awe of that and be in the ecstasy of that awareness. But something said, keep going. And then it was to the animal kingdom, and then all the way up to the divine presence, And so, when I went to the Amazon jungle a few years ago, and I visited a few tribes, and what I heard from the Shipibo tribe, they actually talked about this idea that when you go to become a shaman, what you do is you go in seclusion for a period of months and you only eat a specific plant for months until the spirit of that plant comes to you and teaches you its song. And then the song that you learned through this plant, which is not in Spanish, it's not in any indigenous language, it's in a plant language. And then you sing that plant language during the ceremonies to the people that need healing, and that song that the plants taught you will actually take you on your vision quest, on your journey. And it will take you where you need to go to heal. So yeah, plants, I mean, it's amazing. But to bring it back to coffee, on the other hand, you mentioned the dark side of coffee, and that, that is something. But even on the, not as dark as that, but still, as much as coffee is a great tool for contemplation and for conversation and for art, it is also a great tool for capitalism, because it'll get you going and it will keep you going. Whereas other things, other plants, like, of course, in the West, there's all these debates about marijuana. It's really not good for capitalism. And so that's why there's been this pushback the whole time, because it also makes you think, and it'll just make you be like, yeah, why would I do that? I mean, Cat Williams, the comedian, he has this great line where he's like, you'd be worried, you're stressed out about things in life. Like, for instance, you can't pay your light bill. And he said, but you just smoke a joint, and all of a sudden you'll look at the world differently. You say, I don't need lights. I can light some candles. You know what I mean? So, like, there's just a certain, like, thing about that plant, which it doesn't help capitalism at all. It'll make you be like, wait, why are we all working so hard when we can, you know what I mean? So yeah, there's certain plants that work.
It encourages lateral thinking.
Exactly. People call it laziness, but I think it's more nuanced than that.
I think it probably is as well. And I mean, I think for where I am right now, I think these kinds of conversations are vital, but I think they're vital spiritual conversations. I think sometimes I feel that our conversations about spirituality within Muslim contexts are deeply strained. I feel like they're not just strained, but they're constrained. And in a way, for some reason, we have allowed ourselves to become divorced or separate from ancient wisdoms that have, in civilizational terms, already fed the great rivers of Muslim thought and civilization. And somehow, understanding other spiritual traditions, honoring them, seeing their wisdom, even at times immersing ourselves in them with our own authenticity intact, is something that is really frowned upon, and I think has become a barrier to expressing our humanity. And if the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam came to teach us anything, it was to connect with the source of all things so that we could be fully human, because that's all we can be in this life. We can aspire to the fullness of our humanity. And how can we do that if we are not open, respectful, humble before traditions and civilizations, particularly indigenous traditions and civilizations that came before us? We sort of exclude ourselves from them because we see them as primitive or backward or kind of pre-modern or pre-formed. And yet what we've just been talking about is that these civilizations, through their own journeys, their fitra, their practices, they understood things at a much deeper and profound and actually, in equilibrium with nature and creation, far more than we do now. And I think this is part of the curse of modernity, but also I think it's the curse of it's the curse of religious chauvinism.
Sure. Yeah, I always tell people like if you want to, it's important to study the seerah, the life of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, but it's also difficult to understand the dynamics of tribe and the society because it's so different from ours. It's like almost like we can't penetrate it because it's 1400 years ago in Arabia, and it's so different, like almost a pre-literate society where people, and of desert nomads. Like, it's very difficult. But I always tell people, if you want to kind of get a window into it, read Black Elk Speaks. Understand what was written about and by Native Americans, just a few hundred years ago, and also for American people particularly, but I think Western people in general. There's also a type of an affinity for the First Nations, and it's so recent, and so much has been written about like the tribes and how they were structured and how life was, and that contact between two worlds of kind of the modern industrial capitalistic post-enlightenment Europe with this, of course we're not going to say primitive, but primal, ancient, in many pre-modern tribal society, indigenous society, and it was so recent, and there's so much that's written about it that there's a lot that you can translate if you understand how life was and their relationship to each other, and their relationship to nature, and how society was structured. Then it will give you a lot of insights, and for me, it helped me understand the seerah much better. But I wanted to
that's a really important point, and I think in a way right now it's a very important moment in places like Canada and the United States, where there's almost a reemergence of a consciousness amongst people about Indigenous culture and Indigenous history. And I think this is actually a moment for us, a moment of humility. And it's also a moment where we can genuinely, lower our heads and say, we have been at fault. We have wronged the ancestors and the elders who populated this land, who first came to these lands. And I think this is the time for humility. And I've often felt that even amongst our religious scholars, in Canada, there's been incredible Indigenous movements to educate and for people to experience and to understand the incredible history of Indigenous people and the depth of their spirituality and culture and myth and language, but also to understand the great trauma that empire, colonialism, racism, prejudice inflicted upon what are called the First Nations. And I think a big gap for me is that our religious scholars in particular, and those who talk Islam, I think there's a need for them. I've often felt like I wish we had a chance where scholars and would-be scholars would sit down at the feet of tribal elders in the places that they live and say, teach us. And we're not here for an interfaith conversation. We're not here to talk about Islam and Indigenous religion. We don't even have the right to have that conversation yet. But right now, we need to sit at your feet, and we need to understand the spirituality that came from this place. Because until we understand that, our place as Muslims on this land will never be whole. Forget Islamophobia, forget the 45th president, forget any of that. We will not be spiritually whole until we honor the first peoples of these places. Because in our sacred language, God brought them to these places. God facilitated their spirituality, their language, their symbol, their myth. This is not separate from Allah. This is all connected to Allah. And I think I feel ashamed actually that I grew up in a place like Canada, and that this realization came so late. That what was missing in our own education, in my own education, whether it was at school or at the mosque, what was missing that I did not recognize, I did not I wasn't aware. I wasn't humble before the first cultures and the first spiritualities and the first peoples. And I think that's a very important part of what I think the future needs to hold for us.
MashaAllah. That's beautiful. And it reminds me, maybe it was about 6 months back, I was in Seattle, and Wasat, which is a beautiful organization in Seattle, they did an event at the Duwamish Longhouse. The Duwamish is the tribe that occupies what is now Seattle. And actually Chief Seattle, his name is Chief Seattle. Seattle is named after the chief of the Duwamish, if I remember correctly. And so we had a gathering with the Muslim community and the Duwamish. And Dr. Omar Farooq Abdullah was there, one of the leading Muslim American scholars, as you know, and many indigenous elders and young people. And it was really powerful and profound, and it was really amazing to see Dr. Omar in that environment, because he really didn't want to speak. And when he spoke, all he said was, "I really don't want to speak. I just want to listen and learn." And he was really moved to tears in a way that I've spent a lot of time with him, but I've never seen him that choked up, actually. And so, when you're saying that, alhamdulillah, that there's small efforts in certain communities which are really leading the way in this, and as you say. And, basically, I'd like to transition now into speaking a little bit about your work, because speaking of people that are torchbearers and leading the way in the Muslim communities, particularly in the West, maybe for those that aren't aware of what you're doing, we'll get into what you have planned in the coming years, but I'd love to just hear a little bit about your work with Radical Middle Way and other endeavors that you've been doing in the UK and beyond, especially for people that aren't aware of, what you've been doing in the last kind of, 15 years.
It's a tough one for me, Siddhi, and I'll tell you why. Because in some ways, I think like yourself and so many of us who are in these spaces, we almost thrive on juggling 10 projects at a time. We're on this high wire act of projects and initiatives and conversations, and I think probably for the last 20 or 25 years, I've felt that way. I'm from Toronto, Canada originally. I was I was sort of schooled in an activist family. My father and mother both came from Islamic activist backgrounds, originally from Pakistan, but were deeply embedded in the Muslim community in Toronto. Since the mid 1990s, I was very, I think, actively involved in the emergence of what has now become the Deen Intensive and the traditional Islam, or the revival of classical or traditional Islamic education. Toronto was a very important city, and we had luminaries like Sidi Nazim Baksh, the award-winning journalist from Toronto, and many others, who I think were mentors to us, and also provided opportunities for us to really deeply engage in communities through the lens of reviving and facilitating Islamic learning. And I was very lucky in the mid-1990s to meet Hajj Fuad Mahdi and his incredible publication Q News, and that changed my life. I'd already been dabbling in writing and journalism, and I started working freelance for Q News, and in the late 1990s, became a columnist for the one of Canada's largest newspapers, the Toronto Star. So we were doing this work of kind of trying to revive classical Islamic education within contemporary contexts, at the same time commenting and reporting on issues of spirituality and through Muslim eyes. And then, of course, at Q News, we were kind of exploring the breadth of not just the British Muslim experience, but the global Muslim experience with a journalistic lens. During that time, I became a history and drama teacher, and so my love for drama and art was sort of merged with a professional calling. And I remember one of the first really interesting cultural projects that I was involved in was way back in 1997, when, in the flush of being exposed to teachers like Hamza Yusuf and Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad and others, there was a group of us who were kind of inspired to take that to the cultural level, to see, well, what's the implications of traditional Islam, as we were calling it then, on culture, and where are the nodes of cultural expression that come from this place of tasawwuf and love for God and love for the Prophet. So we organized the first public concert of living spiritual traditions in Toronto. And you know, it was incredible because it was through that I had a relationship and continue to have a relationship with the Tariqa Khalwati Jarrahi order, with Somali Qadri Sufis, with you know, people from the Horn of Africa, from southern Africa, from South Africa, from Malaysia and Indonesia. We were able to bring incredible voices, and they were all in Toronto. And you know, part of it was, wow, I didn't even know they existed in Toronto because we weren't in those circles, but we brought them on stage. And I remember it was a magnificent night, which in a way was a demonstration that we as activists and people doing community work have to be engaged in being also kind of as one of my friends often says, to be archaeologists, right? That we got to go and dig up because it's living. And this is not old stuff. This is stuff that's there. And it's happening in communities. We're not going to know about it unless we're there. We can't be rarefied. We can't be suburban. We can't be commentators from afar. We can't merely exist on our campuses. We got to be out there with people. And it was that sense, and I learned that from Fuad and his incredible partner and wife, Humaira Khan, that you got to be engaged in community. And, you know, 9/11 was a moment, I think, for all of us where we began to rethink and consider the work that we were doing. And my journalism work grew after that. And alhamdulillah, that led to eventually coming to the United Kingdom after Farina and I got married. And I met Farina through Q News. And for the last sort of 14 years here in the UK, I've been working as a journalist over the last 6 or 7 years, primarily as a radio journalist, making documentaries for BBC Radio, the UK channels and the World Service, offering spiritual commentary on sort of contemporary issues for one of the morning breakfast shows here, and that's allowed me in a way to be very blessed to be able to explore things on, you know, kind of mainstream media platforms in a way that kind of engages not just Muslim audiences, but actually seeks to engage wider audiences in issues that have Muslim flavor, but I believe that are incredibly relevant and human. Mm-hmm. And, you know, in the early 2000s, being actively involved with Q News, which was this incredible publication, you know, that was really the first really independent, cutting edge, controversial, edgy Muslim publication that looked at current affairs and culture. I remember when I came across Q News in the mid 1990s, I was so intrigued that they had movie reviews of kind of mainstream movies that were in the theater, but they were written in a way that you know, it was the world through Muslim eyes, and that excited me in a way that nothing I'd read had excited me before. You know, there was this kind of like, we're here, we're immersed in culture, we're swimming, you know, in our contemporary context. We're not segregated or separate from them. And and anything that we see is fair game for our analysis and for our views. And, you know, after the 7/7 attacks here in London, we took that spirit of connecting the contemporary and the classical, of seeing the world through Muslim eyes, and with the organization called the Radical Middle Way, which Haj Fuad founded, and we were part of that founding group behind it, was really to try, in that period of intense confusion and pressure on Muslim communities, to connect religious scholarship with the grassroots, to offer answers and perspectives, create safe spaces for conversation, and to really bring the best of our traditions against the worst interpretations that people were offering of them. And over the last sort of 12 years, Radical Middle Way's work has spanned the United Kingdom, Indonesia, Pakistan, Sudan, Mali, Morocco, Malaysia, and even farther afield. And it's meant the production of documentaries and a lot of content. It meant also for us to engage with culture. And you know, in the mid 2000s, we were able to organize the first urban music and and Muslim hip hop tours of the UK. Of course, hip hop and urban music and from Muslim cultural producers has been part and parcel of the DNA of hip hop in the United Kingdom since the 1980s. But I think it was the first time that I think a kind of a Muslim organization or movement took it seriously and said, no, this is a vehicle for deep spiritual, political, social conversation. And to allow artists, particularly women, to perform as not just equals to men, but often as superior to men, as Poetic Pilgrimage has shown us over the years, that the artistry is kind of blows anything out of the water. It's not about gender, it's about art, and it's about the power of what they do, and to give those platforms and to literally see hundreds, thousands of young people coming to these concerts, staying till 1 or 2 in the morning, speaking to artists, talking about what was on their hearts. People even becoming Muslim through that experience was powerful, and once again a clear indication of the importance of an investment in culture. So the Radical Middle Way was involved in a lot of cool stuff, and it was also a difficult time. We were engaged with government because we had government grants, and in 2010, 2011, alhamdulillah, that relationship with officialdom came to an end as policies changed and became much more tight around Muslim communities, and we knew we couldn't be part of that. So we've tried to continue some of that creative work in various ways and with various partnerships. And I think for me, that work globally built on that work in the 1990s with traditional classical Islam, but also that we engaged with scholars from around the world, and the importance of the methodology was this: religious leadership is vital to have at the table. And religious leadership, not just at the high end, not just from the Azhars and the Qarawiyins and the Darul Ulums, but religious leadership at the grassroots is vital to not just engage with, but to have a voice and not be treated as something parochial and not be treated as something that you can dismiss. But as important as that was civic leadership, and not the civic leadership of big organizations, the ISNAs and the Muslim councils. Then they have their role, but civic leadership on the ground, that was vital and important. But there was a third element, and I thought kind of the third, and I think for me now the most important element, Sidi, is cultural leadership, and that's what we've ignored. We've talked about political leadership and civic leadership. We've talked, and sometimes even, unfortunately, I feel now, overemphasized religious leadership. But where is the cultural leadership? I believe people like you, Sukina and Munir from Poetic Pilgrimage, people like Amir Suleiman, and so many others, my friend Asad Ali Jafri, the Night Sisters in New York, Layla Bahrain, the incredible photographer, writers, artists, cultural producers, curators, exhibitors, programmers. There is an emerging community of cultural leaders. They've always been there. Now we can identify them in some ways more clearly. What is the role of cultural leadership in the future of Islam in America and Canada and the United Kingdom, around the world? And how can we now, and I think about this a lot, is that what can we institutionally, strategically be doing to enhance cultural leadership and to create strategic thinking amongst cultural leaders and to impress, I wouldn't say even impress, I would go one step further, to demand that the future of our communities rests on the interplay between civic and civil activism, religious leadership, and cultural leadership. And it's in this nexus, this engine, and imagination and story needs to be a part of it. This is where the future of our communities is going to be decided. And this is where the future of our communities, I believe there's great hope. And having been engaged in sort of partnership with communities, I see the incredible work that women and men are doing every day in street by street, in community centers, through community institutions that are taking care of, the most devastating problems, social and economic problems that they're dealing with. But I also know that surrounding that, there needs to be a cultural water in which we swim, that helps us contextualize, understand, give hope. And I think this is the cultural leadership is the missing link. And if anything that I see in terms of my work going forward with people and friends like Asad and Chicago and other places, people in other places, is this focus on culture and on cultural production and on cultural leadership.
Yeah, this is beautiful.
In many ways, I feel like
Mashallah.
20 years of work and 20 years of friendships and 20 years of learning with our scholars has led me to that. And I'll share something with you that Habib Ali al-Jifri, who is one of our teachers and who I love, and I think I have a special love for him for many reasons. We named our son Abdul-Rehman Ali Zainul Abidin, and Ali Zainul Abidin because, of course, of the great grandson of the Prophet, but also because it's Habib Ali's name. and so for me, Habib Ali has been very important, I think, in shaping my own sense of my spirituality and my place within Islam. But Habib Ali's in a conversation a few years back, actually now, we were talking about the work that the Radical Middle Way had done, and whenever he's in the UK, he takes an incredible interest in grassroots effort and activity. And after we had described our work, he was kind of quiet, and he said, "Culture." He said, "This work." He says, "The cultural work that you spoke about." He said, "This is the work that requires attention." He said, this is the work that you should focus on. He says, "This is the work that others aren't doing and need to do." And I was taken by that because, he listened to the whole thing. And there was something real, when the Mashayikh gets serious. I mean, you've had that experience many times, I'm sure, Sini, that there's moments when our teachers get serious, where there's a conviviality, but for a moment, it's no longer relational. It's now what I'm saying is a teaching. And it felt like that. It felt very serious. And I think that the best of our teachers have always known that and have always seen that. And I think the best of our teachers have always given us space, right? To explore what culture means, because culture is messy. Absolutely. It's not always going to fit within the fiqh. It's not always going to fit within neat theological or jurisprudential frames. And maybe in some circles it's controversial to say that, but I think it's just reality. Culture is messy. Cultural production is messy. It can affirm or it can cause fitna. It can be disruptive or it can be building. And sometimes in its disruption, it builds.
Sure.
So there's all kinds of interesting paradoxes in cultural production. And I think the best of our scholars understand that. And you know what? The best of our religious leadership says, work through it, right? You know Allah and His Messenger. Work through it. Work through it. And I honor and respect that. And I really, to those of our teachers who've given us that space, because we believe in scholarship and we believe in teachers and we believe in mentors because it's part of the nexus of what makes us who we are. And even though sometimes we disagree and we kind of, bristle a little bit and we push, that's the role of the student. That's the role of the novice. That we push.
Sure.
And we've been given space to push. And so for me right now, this is I think we're at a really important moment. And there's a lot of amazing things happening around the world. I look to people like Mark Gonzalez and others and the kind of work that they're doing and really shaping responses, political responses right now, or even our activists who are doing so. This is all part of a great cultural project.
Beautiful. Yeah, I couldn't agree more with what you're saying about culture, and it's so nice to hear. And that's one of the things I always appreciate. That's refreshing about talking to you because, you're always thinking on that level of the individual the communal, the societal, the national, and the global, and at all times. And you know, with a real concern for humanity as a whole, but also for each individual and for the ummah, as well as the Beni Adam. And of course, that's the blessing of being with true prophetic inheritors for teachers, like some of the people you mentioned, is that that's the prophetic inheritance, is to have a Muhammadan heart that really is concerned about how can we maximize benefit and minimize harm for all beings. And
Absolutely,
mashallah,
for everybody.
exactly, that's it. So you've been really generous with your time. I don't want to take too much more, but I know you're just about to embark on an exciting journey to my country. Alhamdulillah, we welcome you. So I just maybe you could just close with what you have in the pipeline moving forward, and some of the endeavors and initiatives that you'd like to devote yourself to moving forward.
I'm starting in just a week, inshallah, a fellowship at Yale University. My father, my father, he was born in British India and came to Pakistan when he was a young child, and he was an artist at heart, really, a poet and a painter and a photographer, and but he became an accountant. Because he had to.
Mhm.
And I think growing up, we were never forced to go into these kind of usual professions. But I think my dad would jokingly always sort of complain, right, about his kids, about his underachieving kids. And it was kind of a running joke in our family. So I remember I applied for this fellowship at Yale, and I've had some friends who've been on this fellowship before, and they really encouraged me to apply. And alhamdulillah, I've been awarded it, and I remember calling home and saying, "Abu, well, alhamdulillah, I'm going to be going to Yale in the autumn." And his response was, he laughed. He says, "Oh, it took a long time, but finally someone made it to the Ivy League in my family." But it's an exciting opportunity. The Yale World Fellowship, the Yale Greenberg World Fellowship, is a really interesting program which brings together every year 16 really remarkable individuals from every corner of the planet together for 5 months at Yale to learn from each other, to mentor each other. But more than that, I think to pursue projects and intellectual and creative interests that they might not otherwise have a chance to because of life and work and circumstance. And this year, I'm really honored to be with this group of people that is diverse as Liberian and Lebanese and Japanese and Nigerian and people from Brazil and the Ukraine. And it's an exciting group of people, and I'm really honored to be part of them. And basically, what the fellowship asks us to do is to learn from one another. We're allowed to take courses on campus and find our own kind of educational path for 5 months, but also to mentor some younger students, but in many ways also to organize events and programs and to use the campus as a space to kind of work through ideas. And I mean, it's a blessing. And Siddhi, because I know you've at various points in your life sort of unplugged and said, you know what, for my creativity, for my sanity, I need space to think and to write and to consider. And I think in a way, this is, for me, the gift of this opportunity is time to think and to write and to consider and read. It's a wonderful fellowship because the family is able to go. So Karina and my little one will be joining me in September. And I think what I want to get out of it is to challenge myself a little bit. And I think I just think to myself, there's got to be points in your life where you've got to do things that are really kind of outside of your usual things that you do. And I'm really excited by the Yale, theater, drama, and dance program. I have an interest in drama, so I think my heart is going there towards creative writing, but also actually in the divinity department towards particularly American theology and particularly Black theology. There's a great course at Yale called James Baldwin in theology, and I hope to take it. I Am Not Your Negro and the recent interest in Baldwin again. I think I've been rediscovering James Baldwin and finding his writings almost Sufi. They're spiritual writing, and I want to kind of immerse myself into some of those incredible stories, American stories that we otherwise, or I certainly otherwise wouldn't have a chance to experience. And in terms of what I'd like to explore, I think this conversation about cultural leadership is on my mind, but more than that, it's on my heart. I think I need to, for my own self, take some time and think about what cultural leadership means. What are the implications of it? But also to understand, and been a kind of a global group of us, dozens of us, and you know these people as well, Siddhi, who've been talking about this for years, who've been throwing around ideas, who've been arguing and debating and meeting on our own coin in various parts of the world and sitting down over cups of coffee and food and talking about some of these issues, and then going out and making culture, of course, is that we need to understand the Muslim cultural ecosystem, and we need to understand it in its broadest depth, because I don't consider Muslim cultures a spectrum. It's not about conservative and liberal. It's not about those extremes. That's the wrong way to look at culture. It's about ecosystems. It's about nodes where people are attracted to, and what are the connections between those. And Muslimness as a spirituality, but also as an identity, is complex. And I think you probably find it. I find it all the time that Islam and Muslimness feeds into all kinds of people and spaces and art where you'd least expect to find it. And I think for me that is like a humbling to say that we cannot impose unrealistic definitions, but we can do nudges. We can be strategic about the Muslim cultural ecosystem. We can invest in certain nodes of it. We can strengthen parts of it. Culture is organic. And then I think that's where cultural leadership comes into play. That's where we need to be privileging in our public spaces cultural leadership as much as we do religious leadership or civic leadership. And ultimately, you know what? It's the music that we listen to. It's the words that we read. It's the art that we look at. It's the clothes that we wear. It's the colors through which we express ourselves. It's our fashions that is the cultural water in which we swim. My son is 6.5 years old. That's the stuff he's going to connect to. Those stories, particular stories, if there are stories that he connects to, those are the stories that are going to be with him all his life. It's not. There is the value of learning and book learning and the tradition and these things. Those are things that help us live our lives. Knowledge is something that informs our lives, but life is lived and life is messy. And life is an expression of our cultures. And if we're not thinking about this strategically, then we're missing the boat. And we have other examples from other communities. I find the example of Jewish communities in the aftermath of the Shoah and the aftermath of the Holocaust breathtaking. How do you build civilization and a sense of self after something so cataclysmically violent? And yet there's an emergence of Jewish culture in the aftermath of the Second World War and of the Holocaust that is breathtaking, that changed the world, that intellectually changed the world, that changed the way we saw and we visualized. And I believe that every people, every spiritual tradition, every history has stories that feed the human story. And I think it's time. Time is now. The time is late. The hour is late. But the time is now to invest in our stories and in our ecosystem, because that ecosystem isn't separate from other cultural ecosystems. It sits alongside with it, and that's where the organic exchanges happen.
That's beautiful, and that's a great note to end on. And myself, I think the same thing, and that's really the main reason I, started this podcast is, I'll always make music, I'll always write poetry, inshallah. But as I get older and just the blessing that has come along with that, and traveling the world and meeting so many beautiful people, and just having people connect with my most intimate, silent conversations with myself as I share them on stage, and seeing so many amazing, powerful artists, musicians, poets and them becoming my friends and collaborators, many of them you mentioned, I want to see this as a legacy where these artists can give back, and that there's a lineage that develops, just like an intellectual or spiritual lineage, but there's a cultural lineage. And, we need the platforms, and we need the support, and we need the financial support, we need the fellowships, and we need people coming together, and we need the meeting of minds and the meeting of hearts, and we need the conversation. So, this podcast is in many ways just a small, drop of water in the bucket in that regard. But as I get older, I really want to, do more. And I know we've had conversations about the ways that we could do that. So inshallah, I pray that Allah allows us to work together in that.
I mean, it's an exciting time, and the fact that you're people like you are traveling and experiencing the breadth of I was particularly the Muslim world, and to be able to bring that energy and that experience back to the United States and back to home cities. That also is I think an incredible part of the story, and it's about our global connectedness and how we can be rooted and cosmopolitan at the same time, and that's the beauty of Islam. I believe that. I believe it's the beauty of our spiritual DNA, that we can do it so easily because in a way our spiritual DNA allows us to be so comfortable anywhere.
Beautiful. So what's the best way for people to connect with you or follow you or connect on social media if they want to?
I'm on Twitter at AR Malik. I have an about.me page, which is about.me/ABDULREHMANMALIK. And if you Google my name these days, my Yale Fellows site comes up, and all my social media is there. So look forward to connecting with the people who listen to this podcast, to friends and new friends wherever you may be, and du'as to you, Sadi, for this and for everything that you do and you have done, for your words and for your poetry. May doors continue to open and the explorations grow ever deeper and more poignant, inshallah.
I mean, you too, my brother, and I welcome you with open arms to my country. Don't believe the news. It's a wonderful place, as you know, and inshallah, it'll be a really fertile time of transformation and growth and depth for you. And I look forward to, what your future projects, inshallah.
Ameen.
All right, brother. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
Thank you for listening to Path and Present podcast. If you want to support the podcast, you can do so in a few ways. One is word of mouth. People hear about the podcast mostly from people like you who listen and like it and say, I know someone who would connect with this, or who would feel this, or who would enjoy this subject matter. So continue to share with your family and friends. Secondly, you can subscribe, rate, and comment on the iTunes page of Path and Present. Subscribing means that the podcast each episode will come directly to you when we release it. And rating and commenting means that it will grow and come up in the iTunes rankings, which will allow it to be available and seen by more people. And then lastly, you can support financially on Patreon. Patreon is a site which allows people to give a small amount monthly to support art or any type of content. And we have a Path and Present page on Patreon. The link is on our SoundCloud page, SoundCloud/Path and Present. And you'll find the Patreon link there. And yeah, you can support there. And we're greatly appreciative of it. I guess lastly, keep us in your prayers, your positive thoughts, and your moments of remembrance. And thank you for tuning in and being part of the global Path and Present family. One love.